1945. The Second World War was finally over. Germany had surrendered. The world exhaled. The Allies had won. And Britain, at least on paper, was one of the biggest winners in that alliance. The streets of London were celebrating. Britain had just defeated one of the most destructive wars in human history. But right in the middle of that celebration, something else happened. Something that would quietly decide India's future. Just 2 months after victory in Europe, Britain held a general election. The results came in on July 26th, and they shocked the entire world. Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through the war, lost badly. His Conservative Party was thrown out. Clement Attlee's Labour Party swept in with a landslide, a swing of nearly 146 seats. It was the biggest political shock in Britain's post-war history. The man who had led the fight against Hitler was suddenly out of power. And this wasn't just a change of government. Churchill's position on the empire had always been unshakable. He'd said it himself. He hadn't become prime minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Attlee's Labour government felt exactly the opposite. They were in favor of Indian independence. And the moment they took office, they started moving. So in the very same year Britain won the war, the government in London changed to one that was actually ready to let India go. That wasn't a coincidence. It was the first sign of a clock that was about to start ticking. But hidden underneath that victory was a strange and deeply uncomfortable contradiction, a historical riddle worth understanding. Here's the central question of this whole story. How does an empire that wins a world war in 1945 end up forced out of its largest, most important colony, India, within the next 24 months? We already know how the story ends. India became independent in 1947. That's a settled fact. What usually gets missed is everything that happened in between, how fast it all fell apart. In just 2 short years, how did things collapse this quickly? What brought the supposedly unbreakable British Raj to its knees? Let's unpack it, piece by piece, because even in victory, Britain was hollow on the inside. Historians have a blunt way of putting it. Britain was victorious, but bankrupt. The war had buried Britain under roughly £3.5 billion of debt worldwide, and a huge chunk of that, about £1.25 billion, was owed to India alone. That was money India had lent Britain during the war by supplying soldiers, rations, and war material, which meant something almost unthinkable. The country Britain had ruled for centuries had, by the end of the war, become Britain's biggest creditor. Even John Maynard Keynes, one of Britain's most celebrated economists, was knocking on Washington's door for a loan just to keep the British economy standing. An empire in debt to its own biggest colony. How much longer could that empire realistically hold that colony down by force? But war exhaustion and empty pockets alone don't bring down an empire that size. The real problem was something else. The real problem was that India wasn't the same India anymore. Not the one the British government could control with its old tools and its old methods. India had become a puzzle London no longer had an answer for. To really understand this crisis, we have to go back through a handful of events that built up to this moment. Because the storm Britain was facing in 1945 hadn't appeared overnight. It was the buildup of decades of a slow-burning fire and a resistance that never stopped growing. Let's go back to 1857, the year of the Great Uprising against the British Raj. It wasn't sudden. The East India Company's aggressive policies, especially the doctrine of lapse, had already pushed Indian rulers to the edge. Add to that crushing debt on farmers, seized land, and deep religious anxiety among Indian soldiers over the new Enfield rifle cartridges, and the pressure finally broke. Mangal Pandey, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, Rani Lakshmi Bai. These were the names that stood up directly against British power. The British crushed the revolt, but the consequences ran deep. The rebellion ended East India Company rule for good. In 1858, India passed directly under the British crown. This is where the British Raj, the version we actually talk about, really began. The British believed they had buried the idea of rebellion for good. They hadn't. Resistance hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape. Slowly, a new political consciousness began to wake up. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded, and nationalism finally had an organized, institutional home. The British government tried to break this growing unity. In 1905, Lord Curzon partitioned Bengal along religious lines. He believed it would weaken the movement. It did the exact opposite. The Swadeshi movement rose in protest. And it wasn't just political theater. It meant a massive boycott of foreign goods, which gave a real boost to Indian industry and Indian identity. And around the same time, the 1909 Morley-Minto reforms introduced something that looked harmless at the time: separate electorates, dividing voters by religion for the first time. Back then, it looked like a routine administrative decision. In reality, it was the seed of a Hindu-Muslim political divide that would only grow deeper over the coming decades, a divide that would eventually become one of the biggest reasons behind India's partition. India's anger kept simmering, like a volcano that hadn't erupted yet. In 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the repressive Rowlatt Act destroyed whatever trust was still left. After that, under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, the freedom struggle stopped being a movement of a few educated leaders. It became a mass movement of ordinary Indians. The non-cooperation movement of the 1920s was the first real crack in British administrative control. Then came the civil disobedience movement of 1930, which began with the Dandi March against Britain's salt monopoly. That movement didn't just wake up India. It put India's anti-colonial struggle on the world map. People weren't backing down anymore. Purna Swaraj, complete independence, was now the goal. At the same time, a very different, far more intense face of the freedom struggle was rising: revolutionary nationalism. Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad, young revolutionaries whose sacrifice lit a fire in a new generation of Indians who were ready to fight British rule. Their message was simple: India was done compromising. Then, in 1942, with the world burning in the middle of the Second World War, the Cripps mission arrived in India. It offered a weak, watered-down promise of dominion status after the war, and Indian leaders rejected it outright. There was no real guarantee of full independence anywhere in it. That failure led straight into the Quit India movement. An unprecedented uprising swept the country. In several provinces, people even set up parallel governments of their own. There's a reason to walk through all of this, because by 1945, the British Raj wasn't dealing with one leader, one party, or one incident. It was up against 90 years of accumulated anger, a massive collective political consciousness, and a will for freedom that simply would not break. And on top of all of that, London now had a government that was, for the first time, politically ready to start winding the empire down. Now, let's come all the way back to 1945. Political deadlock had reached its peak. Almost every channel of dialogue between the Indian public and the British Raj was shut. But the biggest, most dangerous threat to the British government wasn't coming from political parties anymore. It was coming from a direction nobody expected. It was coming from the British Empire's own army. Here's the question history forces us to ask: what happens when an empire's own Indian soldiers, the men trusted to protect that empire, are pushed to pick up arms against it instead? The answer lies in the story of Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, the INA, the Azad Hind Fauj. At the height of the Second World War, Japan captured Singapore. Thousands of Indian soldiers fighting for the British were taken prisoner by the Imperial Japanese Army. These prisoners were given a choice that would change history: stay prisoners of war or join the fight against the British Raj. Under Subhas Chandra Bose's leadership, they chose to make history. They formed a provisional government of Free India, the Arzi Hukumat-e-Azad Hind, and declared war on the very army they used to serve. Bose gave them a slogan that echoed across the entire country: Delhi Chalo, on to Delhi. Nearly 25,000 Indian soldiers switched sides and joined the INA. Backed by Japan, INA forces pushed all the way to Imphal and gave the British a real fight. Stop and think about that for a second. A foreign empire whose entire power rested on the loyalty of Indian soldiers and their guns. How serious a warning was this for them? But the tide of the war turned. In 1945, the Allies won, and the INA's soldiers were taken prisoner all over again. This time, by the very British army they'd fought. Here, the British government made a decision that history would later prove was a massive mistake. They decided to put a select group of INA officers on public trial. Not a quiet trial, a deliberately staged public court-martial. The intention was obvious: scare the rest of the Indian Army, scare the public, show the world exactly what happens to anyone who rebels against the British Empire. The trial date was set, November 5th, 1945. The location, Delhi's Red Fort. The choice of Red Fort wasn't random. It was deeply symbolic. Nehru himself pointed out that 88 years earlier, in that very same Red Fort, the last emperor of a great dynasty, Bahadur Shah Zafar, had stood trial, closing one chapter of history. And now, in the winter of 1945, Red Fort was about to hear a new echo of justice and rebellion. 3 senior INA officers were put in the dock: General Shah Nawaz Khan, Colonel Prem Sehgal, and Colonel Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon. The charge was as serious as it gets: waging war against the King Emperor, treason. Their defense was led by Bhulabhai Desai, one of the most famous lawyers of the time. He wasn't alone. Congress took this trial seriously enough to build an entire defense committee, including legal heavyweights like Asaf Ali, Tej Bahadur Sapru, and Kailash Nath Kachu. And then there was the name nobody expected: Jawaharlal Nehru. Put his old barrister's gown back on and walked into that Red Fort courtroom himself. This wasn't just a legal appearance. It was a massive political statement that the INA's soldiers weren't traitors. They were part of the nation's shared honor. Inside that courtroom, Bhulabhai Desai didn't just fight the case, he put colonialism itself on trial. Citing international law, he made a historic argument that people of a colonized nation have every right to fight for their freedom and to take up arms for their own liberation. This wasn't just a legal defense, it was an attempt to give legal legitimacy to every armed revolution that might follow. But the real verdict of this trial was never going to be decided inside Red Fort's thick walls. It was going to be decided on the streets of India. During the war, the British government had tightly censored every piece of INA-related news. The public knew almost nothing. Because of this very public trial, that wall of silence broke. Stories of the INA's courage, their fight in the hills of Imphal, in the jungles of Burma, spread overnight through every corner of the country, on radios and in newspapers. A political and emotional wave rose across India that the British administration hadn't even imagined in its worst nightmares. The trial pulled people together across caste, religion, and every political ideology. The trial that was designed to instill fear completely backfired. The British thought they were putting the INA in the dock. They thought this trial would restore their lost authority. But in the eyes of the public, someone else was standing trial: the British Empire itself and the legitimacy of its rule. On December 31st, 1945, the court-martial delivered its verdict. All 3 officers, Shah Nawaz Khan, Prem Sehgal, and Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, were found guilty of treason. Under the law, they could be sentenced to death. But the flood of people on the streets outside had already tied the British government's hands. Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, wrote a confidential letter to his senior officers admitting that punishing these 3 men could set off chaos across the entire country. And worse, it could trigger a mutiny inside the Indian Army itself, which meant something extraordinary. The very army the British Raj was built on top of was now a question mark. On January 3, 1946, Auchinleck made a decision that would go down in history. All 3 sentences were overturned. All 3 men were released immediately. Shah Nawaz Khan, Prem Sehgal, and Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon walked out of Red Fort. A Muslim, a Hindu, and a Sikh shoulder to shoulder. They didn't walk out like convicts. They walked out like winners. The whole country welcomed them home as national heroes. The trial the British had started to spread fear had turned into one of the biggest symbols of Indian communal unity and national pride. The Red Fort trial was only the opening note of a much bigger storm building in the Indian public consciousness. The foundations of the British Raj were shaking, and what came out of that trial was about to turn into a fire that would burn away whatever grip the empire had left. The crowds outside Red Fort's cold walls had already rewritten the British government's political math. The trial was against 3 INA officers, but in the eyes of the country, the real verdict being delivered was against the British government itself. This wasn't a legal debate. It was a direct, open challenge to the legitimacy of the British Empire. But the most dangerous part of all this wasn't happening inside the courtroom. It was happening outside it. This trial had tied all of India together, Stories that had been locked away by censorship were now front-page news. The battles Indian soldiers had fought in the jungles of Imphal and Kohima had become every Indian family's story. The British administration was in shock at a wave of public support this size. But the British Raj's worst nightmare hadn't arrived yet. Here's a question worth asking directly. If a huge part of the Indian public was already furious with British rule, what happens when that same anger reaches the Indians who were themselves the backbone of the British system? The answer arrived in early 1946 as an explosion that shook the British Raj to its spine. February 18, 1946, Bombay Harbor. A Royal Indian Navy signal training ship, HMIS Talwar, Indian sailors mutinied. It started small, a strike over bad food and racial discrimination from British officers. But the wave of national feeling stirred up by the INA trials turned that strike into a full political rebellion within hours. A naval strike committee formed under MS Khan and Madan Singh. The mutiny spread fast, out of Bombay into Karachi, Calcutta, and Cochin. Thousands of Indian sailors rose up against British authority. They tore down the Union Jack. In its place, they raised the flags of Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party together. Take a moment to really understand what that meant. How was the British Empire even holding India together? Were a handful of British soldiers really ruling over hundreds of millions of Indians on their own? Not even close. The entire structure of British rule was built on the loyalty of Indian soldiers, Indian police, and Indian civil servants. The Royal Indian Navy mutiny sent London one unmistakable message: they could no longer trust their own Indian forces. Many historians consider the 1946 naval mutiny the single most decisive warning that convinced the British government that controlling India by force was no longer possible. Talwar had broken, and an empire that can no longer rely on its own soldiers to defend it, its fall becomes a matter of time. The British government now understood completely that they had to leave India, but now they were facing a new problem, one far more complicated than the first. How would they actually leave, and who would they hand power to? To try to solve this political crisis, in 1946, the British government sent a high-level delegation to India, known as the Cabinet Mission. Its goal was to build a constitutional framework that would let power transfer peacefully without tearing India apart. But that job was nowhere near as simple as it sounded. India's political landscape was now completely split. On one side stood the Indian National Congress, led by leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel. Congress's demand was clear: a united, independent India with a strong central government. On the other side stood the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah and the Muslim League were no longer willing to accept any arrangement that left Muslims as just another minority. Their demand was just as clear: a separate, independent, sovereign nation for Muslims, Pakistan. The cabinet mission's biggest challenge was trying to reconcile two demands that flatly contradicted each other. But how did this gap get so deep in the first place? To understand that, we have to go back a little further. The Hindu-Muslim political divide didn't appear overnight. For decades, the British government had followed a simple strategy in India: divide and rule. As we already saw, the seeds were planted back in 1909 when separate electorates were introduced along religious lines for the first time. Over time, questions of political representation, competing rights, and growing mistrust between both communities widened that gap so much that by 1946, it had become a divide almost impossible to bridge. The cabinet mission spent weeks in long, exhausting talks with both Congress and the Muslim League. They proposed a plan that would keep India united, but give the provinces a huge amount of autonomy. For a moment, it looked like both sides might actually agree, but the wall of mistrust was too high. That agreement collapsed almost as fast as it was reached. Political deadlock had hit its ceiling. Every channel between Congress and the Muslim League had shut down, and when politics fails, violence usually takes its place. August 1946, the Muslim League called for Direct Action Day to push for Pakistan. What happened on the streets of Calcutta on August 16, 1946, remains one of the darkest chapters in Indian history. Ferocious communal riots broke out. In just 4 days, Official figures put the death toll at around 4,000, with close to 100,000 people left homeless. Many historians believe the real number was much higher, possibly as high as 10,000. It became known as the Great Calcutta Killings. But the violence didn't stay in Calcutta. It spread like wildfire to Noakhali, to Bihar, to the United Provinces, and then to Punjab. The whole country was catching fire with communal hatred. Now look closely at the position the British government was actually in. By late 1946, Britain wasn't just facing a political problem. They were losing on every front at once. Politically, Congress and the Muslim League couldn't reach any agreement. On the streets, mass movements and violent mobs were completely out of control. Communal riots were tearing through the country, and the police and administration were almost powerless to stop them. After the naval mutiny, the loyalty of the army itself was in serious doubt. And on top of all of it, after winning the Second World War, Britain was so exhausted, economically and mentally, that it no longer had the strength to launch a new military campaign in India. The steel frame, the backbone of British administration in India, was melting from the inside. Viceroy Lord Wavell, running the administration at the time, was proving completely unable to bring the situation under control. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his government were now facing an ugly truth. If they stayed in India, they'd be walking into a civil war they couldn't stop at any price. And if they left suddenly, without any agreement, rivers of blood could flow across the country. The British Empire wasn't governing India, it was just trying to... Finally, on February 20th, 1947, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee made a historic and startling announcement in the House of Commons. He declared that Britain would hand over power in India completely, no later than June 1948. It was a major strategic move. The British Raj now had an expiry date. Attlee hoped the pressure of a fixed deadline would force Indian leaders to stop fighting each other and reach some kind of agreement. Britain had finally, firmly decided to leave India. But now the biggest question was, how do you wind down an empire this size, this fast? How do you free a country that's tearing itself apart from the inside, burning in communal violence? To handle this impossible, dangerous job, Britain decided to send in its last big weapon. One man handed the job of untangling this entire historical mess and writing the final page of the British Empire. That man was Lord Mountbatten. March 22, 1947, Delhi's Safdarjung Airport. Lord Louis Mountbatten sets foot in India as the 34th and final viceroy of the British Raj. On his shoulders sat one of the most difficult, most complicated, most dangerous responsibilities in British history: dismantling the British Empire in India and handing over power. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee had given him until June 1948 to get it done. But the moment Mountbatten arrived in Delhi, what he saw stunned him. India wasn't dealing with an ordinary political crisis. India was standing at the edge of a volcano that could erupt at any moment. The British administration's famous steel frame, the ICS officers, the police, the bureaucracy, had completely broken down. Months of communal riots, strikes, and political deadlock had paralyzed the entire system. Hindu and Muslim government employees, once colleagues, were now looking at each other with suspicion. Even the police were starting to split along communal lines. British officers already had their suitcases packed. They were mentally and physically exhausted and just wanted to get home to England. It didn't take Mountbatten long to realize something alarming. If he waited until June 1948, there might not be a country left to hand power to. The whole of India could burn down in a civil war. But who should power be handed to, and in what form? Mountbatten immediately began a long, tense round of meetings with Congress leaders Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and Mahatma Gandhi, and with Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Mountbatten's original brief was to keep India united, but the failure of the cabinet mission in 1946, followed by the bloodshed in Calcutta, Noakhali, and Punjab, had changed every political equation. The gap of mistrust had grown too deep for any constitutional formula to bridge. Jinnah stood firm on his demand for a separate nation, Pakistan. His position was blunt: either India would be divided or India would be destroyed. On the other side, Congress's leadership was starting to accept a bitter, difficult truth. Nehru and Patel understood that with a weak central government, that that the Muslim League could block at every turn, and independent India would never find stability or be able to grow. Better, they believed, to let one part of the country separate so that the rest of India could become one strong, stable nation, instead of burning in endless civil war and communal violence. Mahatma Gandhi was firmly against partition. For him, dividing India meant the defeat of everything he'd fought for his entire life. But the reality on the ground had drifted far from the ideals of nonviolence and peace. And then came the day that decided everything. June 3, 1947, Mountbatten announced the 3 June Plan, the plan for partition, over all India radio. India would be split into 2 independent, sovereign nations, India and Pakistan. But along with that announcement came a decision that stunned everyone. He moved the date of the transfer of power up from June 1948 all the way to August 15, 1947. Sit with how serious that was. Suddenly, the British Raj didn't have 14 months left to leave India. It had 73 days. Just 73 days. Why was Britain suddenly in such a hurry? Why the rush? The answer was buried in the British government's own fear. The British administration knew by now that they could no longer maintain law and order in India. If they stayed any longer, the responsibility and the blame for the communal riots spreading across the country would land squarely on them. They wanted out of this burning country as fast as possible without owning any of the responsibility. What happened in those 73 days was one of the fastest, most chaotic administrative divisions in history. An empire built over 200 years was being cut in two in barely 10 weeks. The government treasury was split. The Indian Army, the force the British had once been so proud of, was being divided overnight into Hindu and Muslim regiments. Railway carriages, police weapons, office chairs, typewriters, even library books were being divided between the two new countries. It was administrative madness, moving at a terrifying speed. But the biggest challenge wasn't any of that. Dividing a country on paper is easy. Dividing it on the ground is something else entirely. What happens to the people whose homes, farms, and livelihoods fall right on top of that line? Sir Cyril Radcliffe was brought in from London to draw the new borders between India and Pakistan. Radcliffe was a British judge who had never set foot in India before. He knew almost nothing about the geography, the culture, or the people. The British government's reasoning was that someone with no connection to India would be able to draw the lines impartially. Radcliffe was given just 5 weeks to slice through provinces as vast and densely populated as Punjab and Bengal. Sitting in a closed, humid room in Delhi, working off old maps and outdated census records, Radcliffe drew a pencil line that decided the fate of tens of millions of people. Fields were cut off from farmland. Rivers were cut off from their banks. In some places, a single house ended up split between 2 different countries. The most terrifying part was this. Right up until Independence Day, nobody actually knew where the new border ran. People had no idea whether they'd wake up on August 15th in India or in Pakistan. The British government didn't want border disputes disrupting the independence celebrations. By August, it was clear this wasn't just going to be a celebration. This freedom was going to come at an enormous cost. As August 15th approached, fear and uncertainty spread across the country, especially in Punjab and Bengal. When the new borders were finally announced, millions of people suddenly found themselves in a strange country, often an enemy country. What followed was the largest, fastest, and most painful displacement in human history. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan for their lives, racing toward India. Muslims fled India toward Pakistan. Trains were packed to their rooftops with refugees. Trains that crossed the new border often arrived full of corpses. Millions walked on foot, leaving everything behind toward a future nobody could see. Families were torn apart without mercy. Women, children, and the elderly paid the highest price of partition's cruelty. Historians still don't agree on the true cost of partition, but every estimate is chilling. Somewhere between 10 and 15 million people were uprooted from their homes. It remains the largest mass displacement in human history. Estimates for the number of people killed in the communal violence range from 200,000 to as high as 2 million. Thousands of women were abducted and assaulted. On one side, freedom was arriving. On the other, humanity was dying. At midnight on August 14th, while most of the world slept, Jawaharlal Nehru stood in Delhi's parliament and delivered his historic speech, Tryst with Destiny. India stepped into independence. But it wasn't the independence anyone had dreamed of decades earlier. It was a broken freedom. So let's return to the very first question this documentary opened with. How did an empire that won a world war in 1945 forced out of India by 1947? The answer isn't found in one man's magic, one single event, or some overnight miracle. The British Raj didn't end because they suddenly became kind. They didn't leave because they simply lost a war. They left because the entire system their empire stood on had completely slipped out of their hands. It was the buildup of 90 years of unbreakable nationalism, dating back to 1857. It was the result of the mass awakening Mahatma Gandhi had sparked, pulling millions of ordinary Indians onto the streets and crippling British administration through non-cooperation and civil disobedience. It was the outcome of the sacrifice of revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh and Chandra Azad, who planted fear at the very roots of imperial power. It was the impact of Subhas Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army, whose Red Fort trials turned all of India into a fire the British government couldn't put out. A fire that forced the army's own commander-in-chief to admit that punishment could ignite a full-blown mutiny. It was the outcome of the 1946 Royal Indian Navy Mutiny, which sent London one final, unmistakable warning. They could no longer rule India on the strength of Indian soldiers' guns. The loyalty of the army, the backbone of the British Raj, had broken. And in the end, it was the crushing economic and emotional exhaustion of the Second World War, which had hollowed Britain out so completely that it no longer had the political will or the economic strength to launch a fresh military campaign to hold on to India. A Britain that had itself become a debtor to India. A new Labour government that was politically ready for the first time to wind the empire down. And on top of all of it, the political deadlock between Congress and the Muslim League and the uncontrollable communal violence the British administration proved completely powerless to stop. Together, these forces built a historical storm that made it impossible for British rule to stay in India even one more day. India's independence was the final result of a long, complicated, and deeply bloody process. Nearly 200 years of British Raj, a rule that had held India's soul, its economy, and its geography in its grip, finally came to an end. But this wasn't a clean, triumphant parade. This was the moment a vast empire disappeared into history for good, and out of its wreckage, soaked in pain and blood, two new nations were born. August 15, 1947.